I'm going to be talking about the megaliths of Shetland and Orkney. I'm hoping this will inspire you to get up there because it really is really worth a visit, especially with all the new discoveries that are happening at the moment, because there's going to be an exhibition in the Tankernes House Museum, which is all the new discoveries that they found at the Ness of Brodgar site, which I'll talk about. I could spend at least an hour just talking about that one site, but I'm going to try and squeeze as much in as possible. So thank you very much for coming along. So Shetland and Orkney are off the north coast of Britain. Shetland is situated about 110 miles off the north coast, and it's actually equidistant, pretty much equidistant from Britain to Norway. So the influence of both of those cultures can be felt on these islands, the influence of both of those kind of megalithic cultures. And it comprises about 100 islands, although a lot of those are just little lumps of rock. So really, if you're going to visit, you would be able to do the whole place in a couple of weeks and see most of the main sites. And Orkney comprises of about 70 islands, and it's actually only situated about 10 miles off the north coast of Britain. So I'm going to start with Shetland. Top tip, if you're going to go and visit Shetland, don't go on the ferry in winter because it's quite horrendous. As you can see, it's a pretty wild and isolated place. But because of this, it's an absolutely pristine archaeological environment. There are many, many archaeological sites, many that haven't even been discovered yet, probably because the land is very boggy, and it really hasn't changed very much in the last 1,000 years. Actually, 5,000 sites, 5,000 documented archaeological sites on Shetland alone. So there's a lot to look at. This is the islands closer up. I'm going to start by talking about a site that's just around here, called Stanneydale Temple, which you may have heard of. It's the most famous site on Shetland. And then I'm going to gradually move up the island. I'll talk about a site called Pettygarth Field, which is around here, and then I'll move further up the island. So this is Stanneydale Temple, and it's the only site on the island that really suggests that larger ritual gatherings were happening there. Orkney is very different. Orkney has many, many huge sites, but Shetland, this is the only one that's been discovered that suggests that larger events were happening. I love the way Scottish Heritage have put their little garden gate on it. It kind of changes the atmosphere of the whole site. But there's various things that suggest that it was a ritual building rather than just a dwelling, such as the fact that the front of it has this very smart rockwork, really. That it's much neater than most of the buildings that were just dwellings. And also the fact that it's situated in one of the only spots on the island for where you can't see the sea. And that was probably on purpose. They probably wanted to have their gatherings somewhere where they could get away from the sea because it's such a wild, windy place. This is the stone circle that's around it. Now, it's never been excavated, or the outside of it hasn't been excavated, so we're not sure if this is a stone circle, a double stone circle, or just an arc of stones, because so many of the stones have kind of sunk into the bog. And this is the interior of the temple. It's a horseshoe shape. It's unique in Britain for that. And when the archaeologists excavated the floor, they found that it was absolutely kept pristine. It was, swept clean. They didn't find any of the normal household detritus that they usually find in these sites. And that obviously, again, suggested ritual use. And it has these 6 alcoves at the back, a bit like a chambered cairn. And they found hearths in each of those alcoves. So it may have been like a sort of shrine site almost. You can imagine going in there at night with all the fires lit in each of the alcoves. And the 2 post holes in the centre would suggest that it once had a roof, although none of the roof has been found, so it may have been a turf roof. We also know that they used whale bones as the kind of rafters of roofs to put the turf across. And it may have been the ritual site for the nearby Scourge of Brewster, which is this site here, which stretches all the way down to the sea from there. And it's one of the largest and best preserved Neolithic villages in Britain. It was occupied from around 3,400 BC, which is the same sort of dates as Skara Brae and most of the sites in Orkney. So we know that there was stuff going on in Shetland at the same time as the stuff that was going on in Orkney. And there are houses, clearance cairns, enclosures, all sorts of different shaped buildings on this site. And it's contemporary with these amazing Shetland knives that you can see in the museum in Lerwick. And these were never actually used. I mean, they're called knives, but we don't know if they were knives because they're kind of beautiful, polished felsite, which is almost like a kind of marble. They have these fantastic patterns in them. And Lerwick Museum's great if you get the chance to visit. There's just thousands of amazing objects in there. So this is Pettygarth's Field, which is another site of habitation, which is further up the island. Why they chose this site for a place to live, I'm really not sure, because the day I went there was terribly inclement, and I thought, God, I wouldn't want to live here. but evidently the temperature was a little bit milder then. It was a little bit less inclement than it is now. You can just about see the stones here, and this site stretches all the way up this field. And it's in an amazing state of preservation, really, because it was buried beneath the bog. And not only that, everything they built was stone on these islands because they didn't have any wood. The only wood, really, was bits of random driftwood that had floated up and very, very tiny, spindly trees. There's even fewer trees now there than there were then. In fact, there's only one house with trees, and everybody's jealous of the guy who owns the house. He's the guy with the trees, you know. Two of the buildings stand out at Pettygarth's Field. This is the Yoxie House, or the Yoxie House, if I say it Shetland style, which is very much like a chambered cairn in layout. And again, the floor was kept scrupulously clean, so it probably was a ritual site. And next door to this is the Beanie House, which is a circular, again, a kind of heel-shaped cairn. 33 kernstones were found buried here. So whether all the ladies were getting together to do their grain milling or whether there was some kind of strange ritual use for that, we don't know. And also a spring has welled up in the centre of this building. We don't know if the spring happened later or if it was actually originally built around the spring. We don't know. If you move further up the island, you reach Mavis Grind. I know that sounds like a 1950s porn star, but it's actually this little strip of land here which links the South Island to the North Island. And it's always been a very important strategic site because even up until the 1950s, men would drag their boats to avoid having to go around the North Island. They would drag their boats across this bit of land because there's a very thin strip. And I'm actually taking the photograph from the Neolithic site that overlooked this piece of land. And it actually now separates the North Sea from the Atlantic. So this is Islesborough Cairn, which is actually situated on the end of the loch near Mavis Grind. This is a lovely little site. It really had a magic kind of fairy vibe to it when I walked down there. You have to kind of wade through the bog to get to it. But obviously it was of strategic importance, really. It was very important that the people who came into the loch saw this site as they entered the loch. So almost anybody wanting to take their boats around Shetland would have encountered this site at some point. This is closer up. Again, it's a heel-shaped cairn, and this is unique in Shetland, these little tiny, like the heel of a boot print. And further up the island again, when I say the island, that's the mainland of Shetland. Shetlanders actually call it the mainland, but they're not referring to mainland Scotland when they talk about the mainland, they're referring to the main island. This site's called the Burghs of Howsetter. It's actually a very interesting site because on the map it's just marked as a cairn and a couple of standing stones. When you get there, you find that the ground is absolutely littered, and it's obviously many, many other things other than just that. And these two stones actually mark the entrance to a huge white cairn, which was later raided for building material. So they're red granite, and the cairn was originally white granite. So there would have been a kind of stark contrast between the two colours. And that's not the only case of that in Scotland. This is one of the stones, one of the entrance stones. There's a kind of really interesting duality at this site because there's male and female stones. This is one of the female stones, obviously. And there's this red and white duality as well. And the other site in Scotland that has this kind of duality is near Inverness, called Clava Cairns. And they used the red and white stones within the cairns to indicate, much in the same way that they do at Gavrony in France, to indicate certain astronomical alignments. So there'd be a white stone to represent a lunar alignment. That kind of thing. So this other cairn at the site was specifically red. So they went to a great deal of trouble to just collect the red stones into one area and the white stones into another area. And when I investigated the things on the map that are called field boundaries, I thought, well, these aren't field boundaries at all. They're huge rocks. They wouldn't have gone to this amount of effort to move these massive stones. And literally they mark fields that are sort of a metre apart from each other. So they wouldn't have gone to that much effort to mark those kind of field boundaries. So they're obviously actually alignments. And they all run northeast, southwest, which is a classic alignment orientation. And there's things such as this large red boulder. I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but just there's like these kind of marker stones. And just like the recumbent stones at Karnak, I think these are actually placed there on purpose as kind of astronomical cross lines. So they're there as symbolic markers to draw your attention. They're not just randomly scattered. And this is the enclosure at the end of the alignment. So the alignments actually join the cairns at the back to the enclosure. And again, this supposedly is an animal enclosure, but it's obviously not, because who's going to move stones this large to keep their sheep in, in place? And further up the island again, we have a site called the Giant Stones of Hamnavoe. There's actually only 2 stones left standing, but Alexander Thom surveyed the site, and he said that it was most definitely a stone circle, and you can actually see the remainders of some of the stones in the ground, and also the layout of the land as well. It's like a large, flat, sort of circular bit of land. Other single stones of interest are this one, which is the Wormadale stone. This was quite an amazing site. It was very kind of Lord of the Ringsy. I went up there on my own in the snow, and the wind was blowing, and the light was very peculiar. It's about as far away from anywhere as you can get in Britain. And also, incidentally, where I reversed my van onto a boulder and became impaled and had to ring the AA, which cost a pretty penny. And this is the same story again, the same stone again. And it has the typical phallic lean to it. Obviously, most of the stones that have this phallic lean, there's so many of them that they were actually done on purpose. It hasn't slipped into that position over time. It was actually erected like that on purpose. So if you do become reliant on public transport, I had to put this photograph in, if you do become reliant on public transport, they make you very comfortable in the Shetland Islands, because you might be waiting about 10 years for a bus. So this is the border stubble stone, which is another one of the single menhirs. Again, this had a real fairy feel to it. It's quite a beautiful place. And it's like a huge axe head. I wonder if they actually shaped it on purpose to be like a huge axe head, and it has this kind of feeling that it's floating on the water. Again, there's a story that it was hurled by the devil, which is the story that's always connected with single menhirs, and it was to kind of scare the pagans off going to visit these sites anymore. And this is the Buster Bray stone. Now, there's a story about this stone as well, that it was hurled by the giant of Mavis Grind at the giant of Papastur. So that could well be a kind of folk memory of a boundary stone. It represented the areas, between the tribes. And also there's an interesting reference there to the personification of the landscape and giants within the landscape, like at Callanish. And this is the murder stone at Tingwall. It's got this interesting slash of white quartz across it, which a lot of the stones in Shetland have, and I think they were purposefully chosen for that. And that may be why it's called the murder stone, because it's like a kind of slash across it. But interestingly, this is situated at a place called Tingwall. And Ting is a very important name in Shetland and Orkney. It's the Old Norse word for assembly or meeting place. And that has a great deal of relevance, really. It looks out across the loch. So the traditional story for that stone was that it was erected to commemorate one of the Earls of Orkney's sons who was murdered. But actually it's much older than that. That's just the most recent story about it. So the stone actually looks out over the loch and looks out over this little island called Lortingholm. And the significance of this site is very interesting, because it got me really thinking about the sites on Orkney, because it has this single entry causeway. And tradition has it that the chieftains, the Norse chieftains, all of their tribes brought some earth with them to actually create these mounds. So the mounds and the islands were created from earth that each of the tribes had brought. And that was a very symbolic gesture, because it meant that each chieftain was on his own land. So it was a neutral space to have a meeting, and it was the space from which law was decreed. So it was a kind of symbolic fairness, really. And it got me thinking about Orkney. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to Orkney, because there's an awful lot to talk about. So Orkney really has this amazing collection of monuments that are on a par with Stonehenge and Avebury. So if you're into stones, you've got to go there. And so many of them are in really good condition, because they've been protected for so many years. So this is an amazing ritual complex. I'm going to talk about each site in turn. The new Ness of Brodgar site that they've been excavating. You may have seen Neil Oliver on BBC with his hair blowing in the wind and his corduroy trousers flapping, talking about it. I'm going to start by talking about the stones of Stenness. They're one of the oldest stone circles in Britain. They've been radiocarbon dated to about 3100 BC, which actually, if you believe the radiocarbon dating method, it actually predates Stonehenge and the pyramids, as do many of the sites on the Ness of Brodgar. So it really gets you thinking about, which direction the influence came from and were these people actually travelling south, taking their influence with them. It dates to the same period as Skara Brae as well, which I'll talk about. This is my friend B, just placed in the photograph to show you how tall these stones are, because they're actually on a par with Stonehenge. This one's 19 feet, that's the tallest one's 19 feet high. And just like the Ting sites, geological surveys have proved that these stones were brought from all over Shetland. So they weren't just brought from one quarry site, they were brought from places all over the place, either the land of the tribes or specific spiritual sacred places. So they really are strikingly slim. They're sort of the supermodels of the megalithic world. Although the rock does fracture naturally like this, if you go down on the beaches, you can see these huge slabs of rock that have kind of come off that are naturally shaped like this. So this is a plan of Stenness. Originally there was this rock-cut ditch and bank around the outside of it. And they found 12 post holes, although only 4 stones remain. It's possible that 2 of these stones were never actually erected. And also the interesting thing is that the ditch was below the water table. And it would have been below the water table even when they dug it. So they actually made the ditch as a purposeful element of the design. They wanted it to be an island, just like the Ting sites. They wanted it to be a place that wasn't accessed easily. So you can see the remains of the mound, the outside mound here, and the ditch obviously is filled in. This is Hoy in the background, which I'm going to talk about the relevance of that. They found all sorts of interesting things in the ditch. They found what they think were wolf bones, or certainly very, very large dogs. They found sheep and cattle, cremated remains. They found the remains of a cremated human hand. And they found an awful lot of this stuff called grooveware, which particularly interests me because I'm a potter. So grooveware has this typically flat bottom, and it's got these markings on it that would have been made with a tool or a fingernail or something. And the interesting thing about this stuff is that they found it a lot further south. When they excavated the initial building stages of Stonehenge, they found a lot of grooved-ware. So we know that the people who were out in Orkney, because this style of pottery actually developed in Orkney, we know that those people had interaction with the people who were building Stonehenge. And the other interesting thing is that they found this site called Balfarg in Fife, which is absolutely bizarre. It's kind of right in the middle of a Scottish Pebble Dash council estate. And they've built round it, so it's like a roundabout in the middle of the council estate. And there's a huge henge, and there's 2 stones left, but it's in the middle of this kind of strange estate. But they found pots there that contained black henbane. They've got the residue of black henbane. And then black henbane is very, very powerful hallucinogen. It's the witch's drug. It was incredibly, to be very careful about taking it because it could kill you very, very easily. So they were having pretty cosmic trips, I imagine. And it does beg the question, were they holding electric Kool-Aid acid parties at the stones? Don't know. So back to Stenness. This is the hearth. And Dr. Colin Richards, who was the original excavator, the original archaeologist at the site called Barnhouse, which I'll discuss in a moment, reckoned that this hearth had been moved from the centre of Barnhouse. So it was kind of a symbolic moving of the heart of the village, the centre of the village, to the centre of the stones. And various things have been found in this hearth, so that we know that they were using it for burial and funerary rites because there's pottery, evidence of feasting, that kind of thing. So this is Barnhouse. It doesn't look like a particularly spectacular site, but as with so many of the sites, it's kind of the least interesting ones that are actually very important. And Barnhouse was one of the first sites on the Ness of Brodgar. It's been dated to around 3400 BC, and it's actually only 500 feet from the stones of Stenness. We know that the sites are connected because the entrance to the main building at Barnhouse faced the causeway to the stones of Stenness, pottery that was found in both of the sites that linked them, and of course the hearth that had been transplanted from the centre of the village to the centre of the stones. And it's very similar to Skara Brae in a lot of ways, although it's not as well preserved. 3300 BC was some of the earliest structures, 3300, 3400 BC, and it dates to the same time as the newly excavated Ness of Brodgar site as well. And the similarities between the sites is that They had central hearths. They also had these things called dressers, which you probably know about. You'll have seen pictures of the dressers. And I find it quite hilarious, really, because you have this sort of image of some kind of Flintstones person with a flat pack thing that they've bought at IKEA, you know, flat pack stone dresser thing that they've got to keep their grooved away knickknacks on. And actually, I think it's much more complex than that, because we're finding evidence that these weren't actually occurring in domestic buildings. They were occurring in ritual buildings. And the newly excavated site at the Ness of Brodgar, there are another 4 dressers, and they weren't even in a domestic building, so they must have been using them for altars, I think. So I'll call them altars from now on. And there's a parallel between Mongolian yurts. A lot of these buildings at Ness of Brodgar and Skara Brae are actually kind of the same layout as the Mongolian yurt. We know from 3,000 years of historical evidence from Mongolian yurts that they had altars facing the main entrance and that the layout was very, very similar. So this is the dresser at Skara Brae, moving on to Skara Brae. You can't actually go down into these spaces at Skara Brae. You have to kind of walk around the outside and take photographs from above. But Skara Brae had these dressers in every single one of the buildings, bar one, had dressers in it, altars. Each of the altars had a stone in front of it, so it's almost like they were sitting in front of them, meditating or whatever, you know. They all have these bed boxes and the central hearths. The bed boxes are interesting because one of the buildings had bed boxes which had 2 old ladies buried underneath them. So they think they were the matriarchs of the tribe. And the interesting thing about that building was it was the only building that could be locked from the outside. So they were actually locking people in. All the other buildings were lockable from the inside as protection, but they were actually shutting people into this room with the ancestors, presumably. So it may have been like an initiation room or something like that. There's a network of passages. This is a plan of Skara Brae. All of the passages run off the main street. You have to stoop to enter, which it's highly likely that that was actually because it was a sacred site. It wasn't just a dwelling place. It was kind of interlinked with the whole idea of the place being sacred. And there was a Neolithic low road that linked Skara Brae and all the other sites, so there was a direct route between all the sites. And the site would have been very protected from the weather because they have this stuff called midden. If you say your bedroom looks like a midden in Scotland, it's because it's a real mess, because it's all made up of kind of compost and ash from the fires, the shells that they were eating, all sorts of kind of random objects. But it's actually a very, very good insulation. It keeps the houses very warm, and in kind of hard winters, if you're living outdoors, it was a great thing to have your house surrounded by, kind of living in a nice warm compost heap. And many, many exciting artefacts have been found at Skara Brae. You can see them in the museum. This one's one of the typical stone Scottish balls. It has 78 nodes, which may well be a reference to 6 years of the lunar cycle. This is more of them in the museum. So I think they were not only ceremonial objects, but actually didactic tools for the teaching of astronomy. And a chap called Ewan Mackay wrote a book called The Megalith Builders in the late 70s, early 80s. And he wasn't very popular with academia at the time for suggesting it, but he reckoned that there was a priesthood of astronomers who were actually leading the ceremonies at the stones and who actually lived at Skara Brae. And I really think, in relationship to the new sites that have been discovered, that that is quite possible. So both Skara Brae and Barnhouse were abandoned at the end of their lives. Barnhouse was actually purposefully destroyed. When it was almost like a ceremonial destruction of the site. When they'd finished with it, they actually destroyed all the buildings. Skara Brae, it was always suggested that it was a storm that destroyed it, but that's highly unlikely because the sea was actually considerably lower at the time. And also, they probably would have gone back to collect their ceremonial objects and things after the storm if that had happened. So I think it's much more likely that that they were actually... Sorry, something just popped up on the screen and completely distracted me. It's more likely that they were actually leaving those sites on purpose. Like at Skara Brae, you have this story of the scattered bead necklace, as if some lady had rushed out and dropped her beads on the floor because of the storm coming in. But I think it's much more likely that that was actually a symbolic offering at the end of the life of the site. So it'd be very short-sighted, really, to only bend your head in one direction. You know, the archaeologists are very obsessed with looking at the ground, but as above, so below. So it's very important to look up as well. And the sheer complexity of the alignments at this site, I mean, this is just the basic ones. But it'd be highly unlikely that this would be done by accident. You know, they were looking at the skies and orientating their sights to the skies. When the finger points at the moon, the fool looks at the finger, you know, so you need to look in all directions. So the last building at Barnhouse, this is back to the stones of stenness, but Barnhouse is just sort of just over the other side. And the last building at Barnhouse dates to around the same time as Maze Howe. And it was also built on a yellow platform of clay, just like Maze Howe. So that would link the two sites. And also the stones of stenness are then linked to Maze Howe because you have things like this alignment here, which really reminded me of something that Howard Crowhurst talked about when he was talking about Carnac a couple of years ago. And he's found this site called the Giant of Manio. It's a single menhir, and the shadow of it falls across a pair of stones like these in the quadrilateral in Carnac, enters sort of between the two female stones, and then 9 months later, it moves round and falls across this kind of omphalus rock that's like a pregnant kind of belly of rock. So you have the pregnant belly of Maze Howe in the background there. And Maze Howe wasn't originally shaped the way it is today because the roof of it has collapsed. So many raiders went in and so many Vikings looking for stuff that the whole roof of it collapsed inwards, so it's much more of a dome shape now, but it was originally conical shaped, like a little kind of miniature Silbury Hill. This is from an old painting of it in the 18th century. So it's dated to around 2700 BC by radiocarbon dating. And this is an aerial shot of it. Again, has like a bit of a UFO thing going on, isn't there? The bank and ditch originally, again, would probably have been filled with water as a kind of purposeful way of isolating it from the rest of the world. And you can see its relationship to the other sites here. This is the Ness of Brodgar up here. Further up you have the Ring of Brodgar. And then up here you have the Ring of Buchan. So the interior of the site, you're not actually allowed to take photographs inside Maze Howe now. So I've lifted some of these off the internet, so I apologise if I've used your photograph without referencing you or for the quality of the photographs. But it's thought that there was a stone circle on the Maze Howe site before Maze Howe was built, so there was a much older stone circle there. They found the socket holes around the henge, and it's thought that 4 of the stones were actually used as uprights in the centre of the temple. And also that the slabs that were used to line the entranceway into Maze Howe were also stones from the stone circle. So this is the interior of Maze Howe. It gives you some idea about how incredibly skilled they were at stonework. This really reminded me of a lot of the sites that I visited in northern Spain and Portugal. So it's really an ultimate expression of their skill with stone. There's stones here that you can't even get a sheet of paper between. And you have these 3 chambers off the central chamber of Maze Howe, and the blocking stones, which were rather beautifully carved. They're actually perfectly square. They would have fitted perfectly into these. There's a lot of Viking stuff at Maze Howe, but I'm not even going to go into that because I don't have time to talk about that. But there's a lot of runic carvings and a dragon and things. But we know that the Vikings pretty much raided it. So anything that was left at the time. They only found 1 bone in one of the chambers. So this is a better photo. This isn't actually Maze Howe. This is another site called Coyness, which is very similar to Maze Howe. It's on one of the other islands. So if you want to get away from the main kind of tourist trail in Orkney, not that it's that busy, but there are plenty of other islands with other sites on where you won't meet a single soul, even in summer. So this is actually Coyness Chamber. I don't have time to talk about a lot of the other sites, unfortunately. And this is the blocking stone in Maze Howe. The chap from Scottish Heritage was talking to me about it, and he said it's actually very easy to swing it across, which I wanted to see, but obviously they won't show you things like that. But the blocking stone, when it actually would have been in place, it has this light box gap at the top of it. It didn't actually fill the whole chamber, so it would have created an effect just like Newgrange, where the light comes in through a gap above the stone. And also, evidently, it was much easier to close this from the inside rather than the outside, which is interesting because it makes you think that potentially they were going into the interior of Maze Howe and performing rituals and things like that and literally shutting the door behind them. So Maze Howe is actually orientated towards the double sunset, which happens over Hoy. So the sun travels down the chamber, lights up the back of the chamber, and it takes place over a 3-week period either side of the solstice. So it's not just actually on solstice, it's either side of the solstice for 3 weeks, which Alexander Thom called the Megalithic month. So this is Hoy. The double sunset on Hoy happens because the sun goes down over this hill here, and then it sets in the valley. And interestingly, the same effect is caused by Venus every 8 years. So the site has a double orientation. It's orientated towards the setting winter solstice sun, but also towards Venus as well, which only happens every 8 years. And this is the valley in which the Dwarvy stone is situated, which you may have heard of. It's in all the books and things. So this is the Dwarvy stone. The Dwarvy steen. And it's in the valley where the sun sets, but it's not actually directly aligned. That's probably because this stone actually fell into position. It's so huge that it had fallen from the escarpment above, so it hasn't been moved. It's just been hollowed out. And inside the chamber there are two kind of bed chambers, really, with actual pillows carved from rock, which you can sort of crawl into. It's a very lovely spot, actually. It's really wild and in the middle of nowhere. The most interesting story from this stone is this chap called Guillermus Mounsey, who carved his name backwards on the back of the stone. And he was actually a general in the British Army, and he got sent off to Afghanistan and completely lost the plot, couldn't handle it. Came back sporting a huge beard and Persian slippers, which evidently really offended the locals on Orkney because they didn't know what the hell was going on. They thought, who's this strange ranger? And he took up residence in the 1850s, and he carved on the stone various things. Oh, hang on, let me move back again. I'm trying to find this quote that he carved on the stone. Just off screen. There we go. "Oh God, I am pierced to the heart. I wake all night and study and learn patience." Although it's unsure whether that was some kind of an epiphany or if he was just being troubled by midges. Also, interestingly enough, Hoy, there's really not much going on Hoy. There isn't even a pub. There's just nothing there. And it's the place where stockings and suspenders were invented, which just goes to show what happens when the mind wanders. I'll move that forward. Sorry, not used to this computer. There we go. Jumping back to the Ness of Brodgar, this is the Watchman's Stone, which is at the entrance to the causeway. And this actually marked the spot from where you could see the double sunset on Hoy at other times of the year. And another single stone of interest is the Barnhouse Stone. This isn't actually a photograph of the Barnhouse Stone, but it gives you an idea. This is actually one of the stones of stenness. It gives you an idea of the effect that happened, because the Barnhouse Stone, when viewed from Maze How, actually marked the exact spot where the solstice happened. So you would have been able to see the sun setting and this kind of effect over the Barnhouse Stone from Maze How at solstice. So just to recap, really, this is one of the most important sites in Britain, and nearly all the monuments are within sight of each other. So it was really a site that was choreographed for ceremony. It was actually designed to be a huge kind of stage set for ceremony. So all the sites are within sight of each other, apart from this one, because this is actually under the water. And this is causing a lot of excitement at the moment. You can see this circular shape here. They actually did an underwater survey of the loch recently because they saw from, I'll just flip back a slide, they did an aerial photograph of Unston Tomb, and they could see actual earthworks running into Unston Tomb from underneath the loch. So they did a survey, and they found this site. This is the Ring of Brodgar up here. They found this huge kind of circular anomaly, which could well be another henge under the water, because we do know that the water was considerably lower at that point. So it would have to predate the influx of the sea into the Stenness Basin. So that was at least pre-2000 BC, so it would be on a par with the dates of the other sites. And also, another thing that links it to these sites that makes you think that it probably is man-made is that it is exactly the same size as the Ring of Brodgar. So we'll have to wait and see. Get your diving gear on. So this really is the site that's causing a lot of interest at the moment. This is the Ness of Brodgar. I would have loved to have got my hands on that house when it was for sale, but this is now housing the archaeologists. So they've actually only excavated 5% of the stuff that's going on here at the moment. So the site itself is the site of 5 football pitches, and they've only dug into this 5% of it, and already it's blowing people's minds because there's all this amazing new stuff being found, particularly artwork. The site itself is 800 years older than Stonehenge, again, so And I know it doesn't look like much, but when you kind of go in closer up, is it moving forward? Go on, move forward. Nope. I'm sorry, I don't know why it's not moving forward. Let me try again. There we go. I'm a bit of a Luddite, really. Put me in front of this kind of technology and it always goes wrong. This is the cathedral building. So it has these 5-metre thick walls for a start, which is not normal for a domestic dwelling. And they found all this amazing stuff. It had a 10-foot high enclosing wall around the entirety of the site. So this site was supposed to be for the elite. It was supposed to be a very difficult to access site, a bit like Glastonbury Festival now, probably. So this is the plan of the Ness of Brodgar site. So they've only actually really excavated these sort of 4 or 5 buildings so far. And the interesting thing about it is that various of the buildings have kind of multiple entrance ways. So it's thought that it was part of a kind of ritual walkway, really, that they would have been following a processional route through the site. One of the doorways that they've dug up so far actually has a fire pit in it. So you would have had to have walked through the fire to get into the building. So that kind of implies an initiation by fire scenario. And it may have been that they were processing from the land of the living at Stenness to the land of the dead at Brodgar. This is the latest structure to have been excavated on site. And it's been called the cathedral because it has this kind of cruciform shape in the centre. This is the one where the kind of Chippendale of altars was discovered. It was red and yellow sandstone, which had been brought from somewhere else on the Orkney. So they transported this stone specifically to the site because of the beautiful colours in it. And it was freestanding as well, which hasn't been found before. And this structure was actually very similar to Barn House 8, which was the latest structure at the Barn House site. And literally both of these structures were the last building on site. Everything else was kind of richly demolished. So it could actually represent a complete change of cultures. And they also know at this site that they had a huge ritual feast at the end of its life. They had a feast that would have fed about 20,000 people. They've found the cattle remains that show that there was a massive kind of ritual feast going on. So this is some of the artwork that was found on site. Since 2009, they've actually discovered 80 different pieces of artwork just in that one section that they've excavated, covering the full spectrum of Neolithic art. So not only have they found these kind of scratched chevron pattern rocks, they've found pecten carved stones. This is very much like a kind of cup and ring mark stone, but then the shape of it actually links it to one of the little goddess figures that they found at the Links of Knowlton site. And it's very similar to the eyes on some of the little anthropomorphic figures, so it may have represented a big kind of all-seeing eye thing. This is quite exciting, and it doesn't look that exciting, but it's exciting for me as an artist. They're finding, it's the only place in Northern Europe where they're finding these amazing coloured slabs. So it's the first site where they've actually found patterns painted in colour. And there's stones that are specifically just covered with red. There's stones that have red, orange and yellow pigments all over them. There's stones with patterns on them. This is the Brodgar boy, who they also discovered on site. They found him in 2 pieces. And for such a little lad, he's had quite a lot of fame, because he's only about this big. You know, the smallest part is about that big. And he's made of clay. And it's unsure whether he was actually specifically a ritual object or if he was something else. Well, it's highly likely that he was a ritual object because there's hardly any signs of wear and tear on him. And he was discovered in one of the ditches, so he may have been an offering of some kind. It's quite likely that he was specifically carved to be an offering. And he's not the only anthropomorphic figure that they've found. They've also found the Orkney Venus, or the Westry Waifi, she's called, because she was found in Westry. As you can see, like I mentioned earlier, that the eyes are very kind of prominent. She's the first representation of a face in Britain dating from that time. She's called the Orkney Venus because she has these breasts, although they think now that it's probably unlikely that they were breasts, that they actually represent large kind of fastenings. So it may well have represented ceremonial clothing, so it may actually be one of the priests. And this is the grindstone girlie. she was found by a chap walking his dog about 15 years ago, and he took her to the museum, and they just sort of told him to go away, really, because they weren't interested in this kind of thing then. But because of the new finds, they're actually realising the significance of all these little figurines. And the influence of the artwork from the Orkneys is really not just limited to the island. This is a mace head that was found in Knowes near Newgrange in Ireland. Guess where the flint came from? The flint was being imported from Orkney. And they've found various other mace head ceremonial artefacts that have actually been purposefully broken at the Ness of Brodgar site. So back to the main stones. This is Odin's stone. Until about 1814, you would have been able to witness and wonder this stone, but then a chap called Mackay moved in, a baddie called Mackay, and he didn't want the stones on his land because he was farming it. So he went about destroying this one. This was the one that he started with, and unfortunately he did manage to destroy most of it. The whole was left until the 1950s, at which point someone's son destroyed that and got roundly told off for it because it was quite a sacred stone. He didn't know what it was. Anyway, Mackay went about destroying the stone, at which point the locals got quite annoyed with him and went about destroying his farmhouse and tried to burn his farm down. So you reap what you sow. It was a stone that was used for vows. It was a very magical stone. It had healing properties. There's all sorts of stories about it. So they used to pass children who were ill through the stone. There were all sorts of miraculous healings occurred. Old people used to put their heads and their limbs through it to heal various things. And also vows were said through it, so not just marriage vows, but kind of work vows and all sorts of agreements. And it was taken so seriously that anybody who broke those vows was actually kind of excommunicated from the community. They were kind of not spoken to for quite a while. And there's a story about this stone that I found very interesting. It's a story about a farmer who wants to see the land of the fairies. And so he peeks through the stone 3 times. And he keeps going back there at midnight every night, peeking through the stone 3 times, and eventually he sees the land of the fairies. And he goes off there by boat, but he's followed by his 3 sons, who are worried about him. So they follow him to the land of the fairies. And they go around the island of the fairies 3 times with salt to kind of protect him. And this is an interesting folk memory because it makes you think that maybe the protagonist in the tale, the farmer, actually represents an astral body, as in so many myths around the world. He may well actually have represented the moon or some other astral body. And I was thinking about that, and then I found a picture on the internet of North Ronaldsay, and this was just a chap who was there at New Year's Day, took this photograph of the sun through a different stone that has a hole in it on the Orkney Islands, and this is the sun around the time of winter solstice. So that really kind of compounded my theory that the farmer perhaps represented an astral body. Then I was thinking, well, maybe he didn't represent the moon, maybe he actually represented Orion. Because that he may have represented Sirius, and that his 3 sons were actually the 3 stars of Orion. Because when Orion rises, the line between the alignment between his belt and Sirius actually points down here to the point on the horizon where the sun rises at winter solstice. And Odin was also linked to Orion in many ways, so the fact that it's called Odin's stone is a real clue, because both Odin and Orion had their festivals at midwinter. They were both hunters, they both kind of hunted the sun across the sky. And they were both linked to Osiris in ancient Egypt, who was the god of rebirth, so it may well be that these sites were linked to ideas of rebirth. And this got me thinking even more. This is the Ring of Buchan. So very little is known about the Ring of Buchan. This is actually further up the site, so it's kind of further along from the Ring of Brodgar. And nobody really goes here. It's a very, very quiet place, and they've never kind of excavated it or anything. The only thing we do know about this site is that it's about the same size as the Henge of Stenness. So it's quite likely that those 2 sites were linked. And if you were to have stood at this site in about 2500 BC, and looked towards the stones of Stenness, you would have been able to see Orion rising above the stones. So Orion actually rose from the stones. And Orion's very important in Orkney because it's really the main, in winter, it's really absolutely dominates the sky. And also this site is interesting if you look at it in relation to the Thornborough Henges. I don't know if you know much about Thornborough Henges in Yorkshire, but it's one of the only sites documented to actually be aligned to Orion. And not only is the site aligned to Orion, but it's actually mapped out on the ground in the shape of Orion's belt. And this is actually from research by a chap called Sigurd Towery, who does a really fantastic website called the Orkney Jar, which you should check out if you're going to go up to Orkney, because it tells you everything about everything, all the folk stories, everything. So I thought this was fascinating because this is the stars project over. So that's the ring of Buchan, that's the ring of Brodgar, and this is the stones of Stenness. So it's an almost perfect fit. And the ring of Brodgar sits right in the middle of it. And the ring of Brodgar really blew me away, actually. It's one of those sites where you step into the circle and you almost feel like you've gone straight into another dimension. It's so sort of weirdly ethereal, because the skies are kind of very strange in Orkney. You have this huge dome of sky. It was the latest addition to the Ness at Brodgar complex around 2500 BC. And it's actually the third largest stone circle in Britain. It's on a par with Avebury and Long Meg. It's a huge circle, 338 feet across. And this is the ditch, which has been infilled quite a lot now. But 11,000 tons of rock were quarried out to make the ditch, so it would have taken them an awful long time to make this huge ditch. It was 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep, so they really didn't want anybody accessing the stones easily. And interestingly, that's a similar amount of rock to the rock that was used to construct the Ness of Brodgar site, so it may well be that they took the rock from the ditch and then constructed the Ness of Brodgar site. Again, these stones have two entrance causeways, one which goes out towards the ring of Buchan, one which comes back towards the stones of Stenness, so it's highly likely that it was part of a ritual processional way. And when they actually excavated the site, they found that there would have been 60 stones originally, so just like the blue stones at Stonehenge. So this is a computer-generated image of what it would have looked like. So Alexander Thom actually surveyed this site with his son again, and he came to the conclusion that the mounds, the outlying mounds, there's quite a few of them, were actually really important for the site, and he had this idea that people would have stood on the mounds and warned people in the centre of the ring of the approach of the moon, or they would have been the first people outside the ring to be able to see the moon rising, so they would have given people a bit of warning that that was actually happening. And again, there are various alignments from the stones to the hills of Hoy and the cliffs of Hoy. There's actually one, I think it marks the cliff on the edge of Hoy, actually marks, if you view it from the ring of Brodgar, it actually marks the minor southern moon set. And in fact, Thom said Brodgar is the most perfect example of a megalithic observatory that we have left in Britain. And it still is, really. It's, you know, you need to go up there and see it because it'll blow your mind. Come on, darling, move forwards. There we go. So at the latitude of the Orkneys, because they're so far north, the moon actually almost becomes circumpolar. When I say circumpolar, it means that it actually doesn't rise or set. So now it does a little bit, but you can still see it kind of peeking over the horizon line. And it's the most weird thing because it actually moves, or the sun and the moon actually just chase each other around the horizon. And they never actually really go down or, you know, they never rise or set. And actually in 3,500 BC, the moon would have been totally circumpolar. So you would have actually been able to witness that completely. You would have been able to see the moon rolling around the horizon. So it could well be possible to suggest that this whole site was actually designed to witness the circumpolar moon. It's perfect for the observation of the skies. You know, it's a very flat landscape with long distance sight lines to things around the horizon. The whole promontory is actually perfect for the orientation that they were after. So lastly, I'm going to actually discuss this because I think I have time. I do have time, don't I? This is the Tomb of the Eagles, or Isbister Cairn. And I love this site because it's not run by one of the big heritage groups. It's still run by the family who found the place. It's on their land, and they really love it. They have a really shamanic connection with this place. 30 human skulls were found in here. And one of the initial archaeologists who excavated the site said that they thought that they'd been bowled in. They literally were so kind of jumbled up that it looked as if somebody actually rolled them in. And that would tie into other finds at the site because all the bones were actually kind of disarticulated. So it's thought that these 30 human skulls, they thought originally there are only 30 people in the tomb. They've actually found the bones of about 340 people, so it was a hugely important site. And there's a lot of cairns like this around Orkney, but I just don't have that much time to discuss them all. But lots of the islands have these wonderful sort of dry stone walled cairns that you can go in. So this is the interior of it. You have to kind of pull yourself in on a trolley, which is really good fun. You feel like Indiana Jones. You lie down and pull yourself in on this little rope. But all the bones that were found here were sort of bleached and weathered as if they'd been outside for longer, as if they hadn't actually been incarcerated in the tomb for the whole time. They were totally disarticulated, and some of them actually seem to have been arranged into sort of larger bones, medium bones, and none of the smaller bones were found. So all of this would add up to the idea that there were actually mortuary platforms around the site. So they're actually building these wooden platforms. In fact, they found a platform similar to this, or the post holes for one, at the stones of Stenness as well. And they would have been leaving the bodies out on these platforms to basically rot before they interred them. So they were excarnated and defleshed before being placed into the chamber. And at the Tomb of the Eagles, they found, I know, I had to put this in as well, because let's face it, it's not the rabbit holes that kill you, is it really? But, oops, fell down a rabbit hole. This site really affected me because it's right on these dramatic cliffs, you know. So again, they've kind of chosen this site that faces out to sea and the wind blows in, and there would have been lots of sea eagles living in these cliffs at the time, many more than there are now, because they're actually a very rare bird now. But in amongst all the human bones at the Tomb of the Eagles, they found these remains of 14 sea eagles and all these talons. So it obviously raises a question about the significance of these birds, because it's highly likely that they were leaving the bodies out to be defleshed by the birds, because the bones have no evidence of scrape marks or gnawing or anything. They have just been eaten and left out to weather. So it proves that it wasn't animals. You know, they're actually left on these mortuary platforms for the birds to eat. So they obviously had a very special place in these people's hearts. And this is Ronnie Simmerson, who's the guy who actually discovered the tomb, and with a sea eagle. It's now cared for by his daughters. And I had an extensive chat. I actually sat and had cups of tea all day with this lovely lady, and she was brilliant. If you go to the site, they'll actually open up the cabinets. You can hold the amazing geometric balls that they've found. You can touch the mace heads and things that they've found, which I'll tell you about in a moment. So it's highly likely that these birds were actually totem animals. Just like cultures all over the world, they were shamanic totem animals. And this idea is compounded by the fact that there's this site called Cwyn Cairn just down the road. And Cwyn Cairn is kind of jokingly referred to now as the Tomb of the Beagles. You've got the Tomb of the Eagles and the Tomb of the Beagles, because 24 dog skulls were found here. And they were buried in exactly the same way that the humans were. So they obviously regarded the dogs as members of the family, and they were given exactly the same burial rites as the people. So when Ronnie Simmerson actually discovered the site, he knew that there were kind of bits of dry stone walling poking out on his land. And so he started digging down next to one of them. Rather miraculously, like within a few minutes of digging down at the first one, he found this cache of items, including this lovely little mace head, which they'll let you hold. You know, I mean, it's really quite magical, because you can't do that anywhere else in Britain, as far as I know, and you can actually really connect with these things. And it's only small, but it's beautifully polished. It was obviously a ritual object because it's not been used. And not only that, but he found this incredible small jet button, which honestly looks like something from now. You know, it looks like you could have bought it in John Lewis's haberdashery department. It's this highly polished, beautiful little object. And also axe heads as well were found there. And bizarre geometric shapes. This thing's amazing. It's very, very heavy. I held it. It's about this big. And it's incredibly heavy. It has a real power to it. And I have absolutely no idea what it was. The lady who runs the place now, the daughter of Ronnie Simmerson, was telling me about when her sister was allowed to hold one of the Aberdeenshire balls in her hand. And her brother twisted it within her hand, and she received an electric shock all the way up her arm. Literally kind of jolted into her body. And they're not, they're not sort of hippy-dippy people, the ladies that I talked to. They're very sort of down-to-earth farming types. And she said, oh, yeah, that happened, absolutely. And they're linked to, all these things are found all over Scotland. So they're linked to the stone sites in Aberdeenshire, where they found loads and loads of the stone balls there. So there's a high concentration of these circular balls found in the same place as all the recumbent stone circles. And the recumbent stone circles are the ones with sort of on one side of the circle there's two uprights and a recumbent stone. And they were always kind of lunar sites. So it may well be that they were linked to lunar objects. So to finish off, these islands of the north really are absolutely magical. Not only can you see the circumpolar moon, but you can also witness the northern lights, which I saw while I was up there, and it just kind of blew me away. It really made me think about how people from that era would have viewed that kind of thing happening in the sky. It would have been like, wow. So you can't actually not believe that you're on the doorstep of the gods when you're up in this place. And I really think that our ancestors were actually sort of psychedelic shaman who knew their place in the world, knew their place in the cosmos, knew their place in relationship to nature and animals. And I really think that we should actually learn from that. So thank you for coming today.